Hey, welcome back. In this tutorial, we're continuing off where we left off last time. We will start by adding the player to the world scene, then we'll create a script and make our bird start flapping so that it can be an actual Flappy bird. Like this. I'll see you in there. Okay, this is where we were last time. And first, I'm gonna go back to the world scene and instance my player so that I can see it in the game. I'm gonna place it right in the middle, and my display height is 854, so I can just divide it by 2 here inside the editor, and that should give me the exact middle of the screen. And I'm just gonna move it towards the right a little bit, and about here is fine. Let's say 115. And now if we run the game, first you probably have to select a main scene. I already did, but you're probably gonna have to select world as your main scene. So do that, and let's run this again so that we can see that the bird is actually falling down. And that's because the rigid body has a gravity scale, and the gravity scale defines how strong the gravity is affecting the rigid body, and in this case it's just 1. So let's go back to the player scene and set this to 0 for now. We'll change it in a bit. And now if you run the scene, run the world scene, you'll see that the player is just standing in the air and the idle animation is being played. Now let's create a script and attach it to the player. This is going to be an empty script, and we'll just say create. Before we start writing any code, let's define an action inside the input map that we'll use when the player wants to flap. And we'll detect the left mouse button for this action. I'm gonna check inside my physics process if this input action is being pressed or not. And we'll use just pressed instead of pressed. And let's define a start method that we'll use when the player flaps for the first time. Because right now our gravity is 0, and we want to set the gravity to something else, to a positive value, once we start flapping. Let's also define a started boolean that we'll use to check if the game has started or not. And inside start, if we started, just return, because we don't have to do anything. We can't start twice. And if we didn't start yet, let's set started to true. And let's set the gravity scale to 5. Let's get a reference to our animation player first. And let's play the flap animation. Because remember, we're playing idle when the game first begins. We don't want to play idle once we start flapping. Oops, I said animator.flap. That's funny. Animator.play flap. I've set this gravity scale to 5 because gravity scale of 1 is just too weak, and it takes a while for the player to fall down actually. So 5 is better in this case. And we only want to call start if the game hasn't started yet. Now let's define our flap method, which we'll use to make the player move up. Let's think for a second. What do we want to happen once the player flaps? We want the player to move vertically up, and at the same time we want the player to rotate counterclockwise because we want the player to look up when we flap. And likewise, we want the player to start rotating clockwise once we stop flapping because we want the player to look down once it starts falling, and the gravity will take care of falling part for us. Okay, great. So let's define a flap force variable, and I'll define this as export so that we can change it from the editor. And we'll set this to 200. Actually, negative 200. Has to be negative because we're moving up. And inside flap, we can use the linear velocity property of the rigid body, and we'll set the linear velocity.y to flap force. We don't need to change the horizontal velocity because our bird isn't actually gonna move, and instead we're gonna make the obstacles, the pipes, move towards the player. Now let's run the game and see what it looks like. I haven't flapped yet, so I'm inside the idle animation and the gravity is 0. And if I start flapping, as you can see, the gravity is set to 5, so the bird starts falling, and we set it to 5 because 1 was too slow, but as you can see, 5 it's decent. And every time I click, we're running the flap method and we're setting the linear velocity to the flap force variable we defined. Awesome. Now the only thing we need to do is rotate the player so that it looks like it's flapping up, and once it's falling, it looks like it's falling straight down. We can achieve this by using the angular velocity property of the rigid body. Now to demonstrate this, let's set the gravity to 0 even if we flap. Let's actually comment this line out, and inside the flap method, let's set the angular velocity to something like 8. And now if I flap, I'm actually gonna move up because I still have the linear velocity set, so I'm also gonna comment this out. And now once I flap, my angular velocity will change my rotation. Each time I flap, the angular velocity is changing the rotation using the amount I set it to. But as you can see, positive values are actually spinning us in the clockwise direction. So let's set this to -8 instead of positive. And let's run it again. And let's also actually print our rotation so that we can better understand this. Oops, if I can type. Let's also print our... it's fine. As you can see, at the beginning our rotation is 0, but if I click, it changes and it settles down at -85. So we don't want our player to keep spinning like this because it's gonna look very funny. So let's set a limit to how much the player can spin. Let's define a constant up here, and I'll call this max rotation degrees. And we'll set this to -30. Has to be negative because we want the player to rotate counterclockwise. Okay, now after we call flap, let's just check if our rotation degrees, which is the rotation our rigid body has, if it's less than or equal to max rotation degrees, we'll set the angular velocity to 0 because we don't want to rotate anymore, and we'll set the rotation degrees to max rotation degrees. Oops, I didn't use an assignment operator there. Okay, let's run the game and see if it works or not. And as you can see, let's also comment these out so that our gravity works again and the linear force is applied. So now, as you can see, the player can't rotate more than our max rotation degrees. Let's delete this line, clear the output, and the last thing we need to do is when the player is falling down, it needs to start rotating and look downwards basically. And to achieve that, we can use the rotation degrees again, and we can check our linear velocity. And if our linear velocity is greater than 0, that means we're falling. And if we're falling, we'll check if our rotation is greater than 90, and if it is, we'll stop rotating because that's the limit we want. If linear velocity dot y is greater than 0, and if rotation degrees is less than or equal to, if it's less than or equal to 90, that means we haven't reached the limit yet, so we'll keep rotating. So we'll set our angular velocity to 3. And if we reached 90 or we're over 90, we want to stop. So we'll say else angular velocity is 0. So now if you run the game and flap a couple of times, and as you can see, the player falls down head first and it doesn't rotate any more than that. And you can actually comment these lines to see what it looks like if you don't have that. And as you can see, it keeps rotating and it doesn't stop. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my world scene to take a good look. And in this tutorial, we added a script to our player and made it so that the player changes animations once we start flapping, and the player can move up once we click the mouse button and rotate accordingly. So this is it for this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.